Well, friends, it's an enormous privilege to be able to share some thoughts with you and to congratulate you and thank you for all you do. And it is so important, and I just want to say that. I just wanted to begin, if I might, with that story that you all know about Cohen, who one night sees Goldberg under a streetlight searching the ground. He says, "Goldberg, what are you looking for?" And Goldberg says, "My keys." And Cohen says, "Did you drop them there?" And he said, "No, I dropped them over there." And Cohen says, "So why are you looking here?" He says, "Because over there I can see Garnish mit Garnish. Can't see a thing. Here I can see." I think sometimes we miss the real news items because we're looking under the street lamp instead of where we lost the keys. Let me give you a classic example. One of the key dates in modern history, 30 years ago, 1989. And for everyone, or virtually everyone, the key event of that year was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and one of the great narratives of our time, the end of history thesis, that the market economy and the liberal democratic state would gradually, and without a shot being fired, conquer the world. 30 years on, how does the end of history thesis fare? Well, I don't know if you've read any of these books, but here's a characteristic sample of books that have been published in the last little while. How democracies die, end of democracy, suicide of the West, why liberalism failed. This is not the end of history. Why did people get it so wrong? And the answer lies in two events that did take place in 1989, whose full significance, I think, very few people realized at the time, because they were not reading the religious map. They were not hearing the religious music. The first of those events was the retreat, the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan in February of 1989. That was almost certainly the moment at which a young Osama bin Laden saw that a handful of mujahideen could defeat one of the two great superpowers of the world. And undeniably, I think, first had the thought that if we can do that to one superpower, we can do it to the other. And thus was born the thought that became 9/11. The second one, much more relevant here in Britain, was the fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie by Ayatollah Khomeini, which led to the return of book burning to Britain in several Midlands towns. This first revealed to radical Islamists an extraordinary idea that in a global age, religion is a global phenomenon, whereas governments are only national phenomena. And from that moment was born the concept, the idea that a religion could become a global force and that you could sit in Iran and develop consequences in Britain. And that, of course, has had huge significance. Now, those two events were simply, although they were reported, fair enough, their significance was not understood at all. And it's only 30 years on that we can all see that those were the two really significant events that have led all sorts of people to question, does the West have viability anymore? And the truth is, this is what is called confirmation bias, that we respond to those narratives that confirm our beliefs, not to those that disconfirm them. Now, I've mentioned just one narrative, the end of history narrative. But in fact, if you step back a little further, you will see that all three other narratives, the big master narratives of modernity, which have been guiding us since the 18th century, since the Enlightenment, all three of them that seemed to work for quite a long time, have ceased to work. Have in fact, every single one of them is now standing as refuted. And those three master narratives are these. Number one, that modernization equals secularization. Number two, that modernization equals westernization. And number three, that any religion that survives will be accommodationist. That is, it will take its tone from the prevailing secular society and will somehow accommodate that. All three of them are wrong. Number one, modernization equals secularization. We have been living for some time in an age of desecularization. The one thing that no Enlightenment thinker or post-Enlightenment thinker thought was possible. We have seen religion return not just as a personal faith, but as a political force. We have seen this obviously in the case of Islamism, but we've also seen it in the case of Hindu nationalism. We have also seen it in the case of Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, and of course our prayers and thoughts are with the relatives with the bereaved and with the injured. And of course in Myanmar also. And as for Judaism, well, there's this wonderful scene that defined Israel, the state of Israel, as a secular state. And David Ben-Gurion had a session with a very great rabbi known as the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Yeshayahu Karelitz, the head of the ultra-Orthodox community. And they agreed something called the status quo agreement, that people studying in rabbinical seminaries, in yeshivot in Israel, should be exempt from military service. At that time, there were between 300 and 400 individuals. And Ben-Gurion thought they were the last of the last. Today, there are more like 300,000 or 400,000 individuals. And the Labour Party, which David Ben-Gurion led, and which was more or less impregnable until for the first 29 years of the state, the Labour Party, in the recent election in Israel, his party, David Ben-Gurion's party, got 6 seats. The ultra-Orthodox community got 16 seats. I mean, that makes it the third largest party in Israel, which is quite something given that they don't recognize the state of Israel, as you probably know. But, you know, and and here, you know, here in Anglo-Jewry, we just finished the festival of Passover. Could we have believed? I was the rabbi 40 years ago of a synagogue in Golders Green, which was, how can I put this politely? It was geriatric, I think would be the word. I remember I was a slightly wild young thing, and I've just aged but haven't grown any wiser. But I remember getting up and saying, when I came here, the average age was 78, and after only 4 years, the average age is 82. And all of a sudden, for me to sit with Elaine in the same synagogue now and see it full of children. I mean, you know, we had a young members group, and to get even 10 people through the door, we had to define young as anyone below 60, you know. And now it's full of children. Why? Because there's now a Jewish primary school attached to the synagogue, and the children bring the parents to synagogue. And no Anglo-Jew 100 years ago could have envisaged the kind of strength we have in our community, especially among young Jews who've gone to a serious Jewish education, are more observant and more knowledgeable than their parents. Secondly, modernization equals westernization. And the classic example here, the westernizing country of all countries, was Ataturk's Turkey. Got rid of every vestige that was not Western, and today Turkey is moving rapidly from westernization to Islamicization. And here you have a world in which 4 ancient civilizations, very proud civilizations, which have treated the rise of the West, which have experienced the rise of the West as a profound humiliation, are today on the rise. And that is Russia, India, China, and Iran. These are ancient civilizations, and they are all on the move, and none of them is moving towards westernization. And as for accommodation, the exact opposite is happening. It is the most sectarian forms of religion that are flourishing, and not the most accommodationist. The ones most that see faith as a rejection of the wider society rather than an embrace of it, and that is happening in all the faiths. Why has all of this happened? Well, simply because the 4 institutions of the modern world just failed to do one thing. They were all brilliant: science, technology, the market economy, and the liberal democratic state. All of them did what they have to do, but none of them answer the 3 questions that any reflective human being must ask sometime in the course of her or his life. Who am I? Why am I here? How then shall I live? Science tells us how. It doesn't tell us why. Technology gives us power, but it doesn't tell us how to use that power. The market economy and the liberal democratic state give us choices, but offer no advice as to which choices to make. And that is why religion has survived. It's a case I made way back in 1990 in the Wreath Lectures under the rubric, The Persistence of Faith. And it has simply become more and more evident since. Now, I don't think the media has covered religion as well as it might. It simply hasn't given it the space or the time or the quality of knowledge that it should have done. And yet religion is still very important in many lives in Britain, and it is essential to understanding what is going on in the world. Religion remains important globally, even if we only see the bad news: the killings in the mosques in New Zealand, the churches in Sri Lanka, and the horrendous shooting that was in a synagogue in San Diego just a couple of days ago. Luckily, only 1 person was killed and 3 injured. But that was because the assailant's rifle jammed. Otherwise, it would have been a tragedy even worse than the one in Pittsburgh just a few months ago, which was the worst anti-Semitic tragedy in American history. So I want to thank, therefore, a shining exception to this, the BBC itself, especially Radio 4, and I know Christine Morgan is unwell. I want to thank her in absentia. Dan Tierney, is Dan here? Oh, Dan is there. Dan was a brilliant producer of the 5-part series I did on morality, and it was just wonderful to see the BBC give a series on morality that kind of space. And we tried to do 2 things there. Number one, get some voices that I think Britain ought to hear, because there's so many good people in United States and Canada. And we got Jordan Peterson, that was before he became a non-person. And we got David Brooks of the New York Times, Steven Pinker, the great atheist. I really am very, very fond of Stephen. I'm even more fond of his wife, Rebecca. I appear as a character in one of her books. It is entitled 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, subtitled A Work of Fiction. They're America's leading atheists. The wonderful voice of Melinda Gates, and our own experts on artificial intelligence and superintelligence, Mustafa Suleiman of DeepMind and Nick Bostrom of Superintelligence. This was a thrilling program. And of course, thrilling because the stars of the show, despite the fact that we had on it the best people, top people in every subject area, but the stars of the show were the school children from 2 schools in Manchester, 2 schools in London, and they were just brilliant. And I hope we give school children a voice in our broadcasting. And the other one, of course, is Thought for the Day. I'm really sorry some of you have to get up and listen to Thought for the Day, but, you know, it appeals to me as a masochist and a sadist and things. But I have to say that Thought for the Day is the single most important institution in Britain creating a tolerant, multi-faith environment. Why? Because it forced me, and it forces every contributor, to recognize the fact that when I speak on Thought for the Day, I am consciously speaking to an audience, 99.5% of which is not Jewish, and probably a majority of whom are not religious. And it forces me to speak in what John Rawls calls the voice of public reason. And that is tremendously important. So when people do that for the Sikhs and the Muslims and the Hindus and so on, I mean, it becomes very, very important in creating a tolerant voice in Britain. And there are so many stories out there. Here's a story, here's a religious story that I doubt whether you might. Look, we've just seen Jordan Peterson, and my own philosophy tutor, Roger Scruton, silenced in a fairly brutal way. Did you know that it was Averroes, the great Islamic thinker, who developed the first argument I have ever come across by a religious individual on the importance of freedom of speech, of giving space to somebody who disagrees with you? Averroes says this in the 12th century. If you've got the truth and you're confident of it, you will want your opponents to be as strong as possible, not as weak as possible. That is then quoted in the name of Averroes by one of my ancestors, the Maharal Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, in the 16th century. The same argument is then made by a Christian writer, John Milton, in the 17th century in Areopagitica. And it is then restated in the 19th century by one of the great secularists of the modern age, John Stuart Mill, in his book on liberty. So here is an argument that's begun by a Muslim all the way through Jew, Christian, secular humanist on the importance of giving space to your opponents. And that, I think, is absolutely relevant to what's happening now. Or what about Extinction Rebellion? Here's a story you might not believe, but it's true. How many people know that before the International Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen in 2010, the Secretary of State for the Environment was a gentleman called Ed Miliband? Now, Ed is as secular as they come. His parents were atheists, and I understand why. But Ed said, I am not going to Copenhagen without a statement from the religious leaders of Britain. And so Rowan Williams invited all the faith leaders for a day in Lambeth Palace, and Ed was with us the whole day, and he took from that conference religious voice to the climate change conference. Why? Because Ed himself knew that actually it's very difficult on pure secular terms to explain what obligations we have to those who are not yet born. Technically, it's quite difficult. What responsibility do we have to a world that will exist when we don't exist? And he felt that religious thinkers, with their sense of stewardship, with their sense of connectedness over time, our responsibility to future generations, would have a message, and he did it. And finally, the biggest culture shock I ever had. I was in Jerusalem 2 years ago, and 3 members of the Eder Haredit, the ultra-Orthodox community, said, could we come and have a meeting with you? And they came to have a meeting with me, and I want you to visualize the scene. These were almost caricatures, the whole works. the long black coat, the gartel, the peyote, the sidelocks, the strimel, the fur hat. And I wondered, what did they want to discuss with me? And here it is. It turned out that they had been hired by a high-tech company to write the ethics code for self-driving vehicles. Now, why did they go to ultra-Orthodox Jews? Well, I'll tell you exactly why they went. Because I want you to imagine, you're sitting in a car and it's snowing and there's ice on the road and the car's going to skid, and ahead are two cyclists, one of them wearing a crash helmet, the other one not wearing a crash helmet. If you're going to skid, which cyclist do you knock down? Given that whatever you do, you're going to knock one down. Do you knock down the one wearing the crash helmet on the grounds that he is more likely to recover? Or do you say, no, if you spare the one not wearing a crash helmet, then you're rewarding the guy who is not obeying the law because he should be wearing a crash helmet, and you're punishing the guy who did obey the law. Now, if you study philosophy at Harvard, you can say wonderful, miraculous things on abstract issues like justice. But on a question like which cyclist you crash into on an icy day, that you need the Talmudic mind. And they were loving this. They were loving it. Every single thing that the high-tech company threw at them, they loved because it was one other Talmudic thing. So there it is. Religion is news, and it deserves serious coverage. But I just want to end with one story that is really bad news. At some stage, I think it was the King of Morocco, wanted to ease tensions between the faiths in Britain, and he persuaded the British Library, this is many years ago, to run an exhibition called Sacred. Does anyone remember that? It was an exhibition of the sacred texts of the three Abrahamic monotheisms. And we did something in the British Library an evening, just to illustrate the point. And there was Rowan and myself, and I don't know whether it was Cormac Murphy O'Connor, or there was a Catholic, and there was a Muslim imam, and Melvin Bragg was chairing it. And he could not get any media source to run a story or to come along. And Melvin got really upset. And he said, if the only time people see religion is when it's about violence or intolerance, then we will get violence and intolerance. If we never see the good news about religion, we will never get good news about religion. Well, religion, I think, is bigger than that. Let us give it the space it deserves, because it's real, it's important, and it can be a force for good. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sacks. And that sort of, I was expecting this feeling. I wasn't quite sure where I would start with this extraordinarily wide-ranging argument that you've just laid before us. But I suppose I was very struck with the image that you gave us of the synagogue, now populated with the children that hadn't been there a generation ago, which is a great thing to hear. And I know from a Roman Catholic perspective, because we have had such an influx of Polish families to this country, we've seen, in some cases, some similar development in Roman Catholic churches too. But in reality, the public appetite for religion, whether it's in the public square or whether it's in the reality of just going through the doors of a temple, a synagogue or a church, is frankly not there. So people are looking for something possibly different and not to our traditional religions. What are your thoughts on that?
I think people... Is this working?
Yeah.
I think people today have a lot of problems with things that previous generations took for granted. Ritual, for instance. I think prayer, they find quite difficult. If we have, thought for the day is 2 minutes, 45 seconds. It feels like an hour, but it's 2 minutes 45 seconds. And the BBC cut it down from 3 minutes about 10 years ago on the grounds that no one can concentrate for 3 minutes anymore. So what are you going to do with a synagogue service that may last 3 hours? You know, there's no doubt there's a disconnect. And we have found that schools really are the best way, because you know, the kids are being inducted into an identity, into stories, into a narrative. I get thrilled, you know, every time I get depressed at the state of the world, I go and visit a Jewish primary school. And all the things that really matter and that people are looking for, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, those things are given at schools. I think the synagogue has been a little slow to adapt, but it can adapt.
But you'll know that there will be people here listening to that, and in the wider public sphere will say, well, actually, religion and identity arguably are at the heart of some of the greatest problems that face us. That separation that arguably some regard faith schools as lines of separation within society.
Look, I hear that challenge very... Look, you know, I knew that if we didn't have a lot of Jewish day schools, we would not have a Jewish community today. I could see it dying out. And so we built the schools, and we now have a much more committed younger generation. But at the same time, I can even date the moment when I noticed this. It was 2004. I suddenly realized that the schools were succeeding brilliantly, but they were turning us inward. And it was at that point that I took it on myself to turn the schools outward. And today they all have an orientation that we call chesed, that is, doing acts of kindness, and if possible, beyond the confines of the faith. I am sad that it has taken this, but I could go to my schools. I mean, I was a chief rabbi. My education was at St. Mary's Church of England primary school and a secondary school called Christ College. So I have a rather unusual CV for the role I hold. But don't forget, in those days, those schools held moral attitudes that were identical with ours as a Jewish family. Today, that's not the case. So you are beginning to see a divide today between the growing religiosity of one part of the public and the growing irreligiosity of the other part. And the country where this is making the biggest difference, oddly enough, is the United States, which remained religious far longer than any other Western democracy. You know, even a generation ago, church attendance at a house of worship at 40% of the population going once a week was higher than in Iran. I mean, where only 39% attended a mosque once a week. Today, 30% of American young people, when asked, what is your religion, answer none. That applies to Christians, it applies to Jews. So we're beginning to see a split, and that does concern me.
And how, given that we're here to concentrate on how the media tells these stories in a better way and better reflects that, what space does the media occupy in interpreting and navigating that? Because it does feel that we're at an extremely febrile moment for a whole host of reasons, not only the political backdrop, but from issues of anti-Semitism and so on. It does feel as though we're at a pretty testing moment.
The BBC, to whom I owe immense thanks, allowed me, when I was chief rabbi, this was 22 times I did this, to make a television program, sort of documentary with a theme around the Jewish New Year, and it was thrilling. And thus I was able to show at the schools where young school pupils were spending time with the elderly in their area, or that extraordinary thing the Orthodox Jewish school, King David Birmingham, where more than 50% of the pupils are Muslim. And I spent the day with them and we learned the Israeli peace song in Hebrew and Arabic and English. You can show the good practice where religion turns outward and embraces the other. I don't know what space exists for precisely that kind of message today, because it was an unusual sort of broadcasting opportunity. But you've got to do the positive role models here.
The positive role models, but also in an age when, as you acknowledge with your Thought for the Day audience, perhaps the vast majority of people tuning in have no connection to it. They have no relevance. They don't have any connection to a church or a faith community and see no need for it. And indeed, not only see no need for it, but look at some of those institutions which have become so discredited. And I'm thinking about, the great scandal in the Roman Catholic Church, just as one prime example of why people have disconnected. And why should people respond to those voices, do you think?
Look, that's a good point. I think if religion cannot admit its own weaknesses and its own failings, then it's failing to live up to its own doctrine. I mean, this whole concept, which is a Jewish and Christian one and a very important one, of forgiveness. Forgiveness creates the possibility of admitting I did wrong. Now, you get rid of that whole Judeo-Christian ethic, then you don't get a vacuum. You get something else coming in. And we can see exactly what else has come in. We have, it was the anthropologist Ruth Benedict, who was trying to explain to the Americans, and after Pearl Harbor, the Americans realized they're going to have to wage a war against an enemy they don't understand, against Japan. And they said to Ruth Benedict, explain to us the Japanese, and she explained the difference between a guilt culture. You don't have a Jewish mother, so you don't know what guilt really is.
I'm a Roman Catholic, I know what guilt is.
Fair enough. So the difference between a guilt culture and a shame culture, now, because Britain has become secular, because the West has become secular, we've moved from a guilt culture to a shame culture. Now, in a shame culture, there is no atonement or forgiveness. Once you are defiled, there's no way back. So either you deny it ever happened, or you wait until people have forgotten that it's happened. But we are deep into public shaming, and that is what the social media, the viral media are doing. They are shaming people in public, and that's a much cruder form of vigilante justice. And it's a much more hopeless one, because once they've nailed you, you can never come back.
And I'm very keen that we take some questions in a moment, but where does then faith find its way back? I mean, it almost seems, not to be too depressing about it, but it feels as though it would be an almighty struggle for faith or religious thought to make a comeback into that space.
Well, I told you that we found the way back, which is via schools, because we understand.
But in that social media sphere in particular.
Oh, in that social media sphere. I don't know. This is a mechanism for shaming. It's not a mechanism for establishing guilt. Because there's one thing with social media. Once you've been nailed, you have no chance to state your case. You're dead already. And I don't have an easy answer to this, this return of the mob. We are back deep in the Middle Ages. We're there in the stocks and the pillories and all the rest of it. And to my mind, that's a pretty unhealthy place to be. Though it has to exist, because you can't have a moral vacuum.
Okay, a lot of thoughts arising out of that, but I'm very keen to take some questions from the audience. I think we'll get the microphone to you. If you just kindly introduce yourself and let us know where you're from, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, it's just on its way. Right. We got one coming. Actually, you are close enough to us to give us a shout, actually, I think. Thank you. There we go. Thanks.
Former Chief Rabbi, my name is Rabbi Jeff Berger. I'm privileged to have received my ordination from Lord Sacks. To what do you attribute and what can be done about the unprecedented desecration of holy places where we've seen within the last few weeks and months that there is no longer any compunction about refraining from committing murder inside houses of worship?
This really has been a desecration. And, until now, places of worship have, by and large, been seen as cities of refuge, as places that are holy ground. And clearly, there is no doubt whatsoever that the forms of religiosity that exist today have been religion in some of its worst guises. Although in New Zealand and in San Diego, these were essentially white supremacists rather than any kind of religious thing. And I have to be blunt with you. There is no moral answer. There has to be a practical answer. There has to be security on every place of worship. We have had now in British Jewry for over 40 years something called the Community Security Trust, which trains people to stand as security volunteers. It has them in close connection with the police. There are security guards on duty at every single synagogue. And it's obvious that that is going to have to be the norm. Since people are not prepared to hold back from desecration of congregations of prayer, you just have to establish a security presence, and to do so with professionalism and to subsidize those communities. I mean, the one at San Diego was a soft target. The one at Pittsburgh was a soft target. But America does not yet have its CST.
And do you think, are you talking about places of congregation, places of prayer and worship, do you think that should now apply in this country to Christian churches?
Look, you need a very, very professional surveillance estimate. What are the risks at particular places of worship? And of course, that's part of what MI5 and MI6 do. They monitor that kind of risk. It's what we do within the Jewish community, because CST has something like 60 professionals that are monitoring risks the whole time. But by and large, Sri Lanka was different because it was an extremely professional thing. But by and large, people tackle soft targets. And you have to make sure that you don't present people with soft targets.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question for Lord Sacks. Lady in the centre there. Thank you.
Hi, Elizabeth from the Quakers. I found it really interesting talking about sort of the nature of forgiveness and talking about the possibility of admitting that we did wrong and that kind of thing. And especially when you were talking about the issue around the Catholic Church and all the abuse and that kind of thing, as well as within lots of other aspects of that. And I think one of the things that a lot of people really struggle with is the fact that a lot of faith groups have actually caused a lot of harm to a lot of people. And so I'm talking particularly as someone from the LGBT community, and finding that actually a lot of people I know have deep faith but have been excluded from their faith communities for those reasons. And I guess I'm not entirely sure what my question entirely is, and I'm sorry, it's very annoying when someone is like, it's more of a comment than a question. But I guess the question is really around how as faith groups, do we admit our complicity when we've done something wrong, and I guess find redemption with people that we have hurt as a community as well, and bring people back into the fold without necessarily saying, well, we excluded you before, we're kind of done, are there ways that we can continue engaging? Yeah.
I, quite early on in my chief rabbinate, I was asked by the Jewish gays and lesbians, asked whether they could have a meeting with me, and then the Orthodox Jewish gays and lesbians asked if they could have a meeting. And I've mentioned before that those two meetings were among the most beautiful meetings I had in the whole 22 years in my chief rabbinate. Because they said straight away, we know, Chief Rabbi, you're an Orthodox Jew, we know you can't give us your blessing, but we want you to know how much pain sometimes you cause us, or your rabbis cause us. And they talked through their own pain, their own sense of exclusion. They made various requests of me. And I sat in both meetings saying, this is a beautiful encounter. They've honestly told me their pain. We are honestly in the wrong because they're not asking us to change the rules, but be aware of what they are as human beings. And I was deeply touched by both meetings. I sat down with the judges of my rabbinic court, and I told them this. And instantly, without the slightest hesitation, they said, you're right. And then we convened all our rabbis together, and together with the judges of my rabbinic court. I mean, this will surprise people because they think that those judges are extremists and so on. The truth is they weren't. They heard exactly what I had to say about the gays and lesbians. And by and large, and the rabbis took it on board, and it became something very important to me. So that once in a while I was able to say things that, like for every Holocaust Memorial Day, I would remind people that gays were sent to Auschwitz, not just Jews. And we ordered rabbis never ever to speak slightingly about gays and lesbians, whatever they had to say in their sermons. And that was a true meeting. It was an I-thou encounter. It wasn't political. It wasn't trying to force any agenda. It was human beings talking to human beings. And I honestly felt uplifted by that all the way through. And I think when we have caused people hurt, we really and truly have to say so and to apologize. There were plenty of people I hurt in 22 years as a chief rabbi. There were many mistakes I made. And I just had to speak to the people I'd hurt and be very blunt with them. And I have to say, most of them forgave me. Whether the one up there forgives me, I'll wait and see. But that is what a forgiveness culture should be about. Once you create the possibility of forgiveness, you create the possibility of saying, I did wrong.
And it opens, if nothing else, it opens a conversation in the engagement that you had there too. Thank you very much. Well, I hope that's a moment of uplift on those difficulties. I'm just slightly aware of the time pressures that we're under. Can I just take maybe two questions together? And I'm very keen to get a thought in about religious literacy amongst journalists. There's two ladies at the front here. Perhaps we could take you side by side, and there's just a gentleman at the back. Sorry, I can't quite see you in the lights. Hi. Perhaps we could take your two questions together.
Lord Sacks, it's funny that Julie Etchingham mentioned religious literacy amongst journalists. You gave an honourable exemption to the BBC for its religious coverage, but I wondered if you could say something about how you see the level of religious knowledge in the media generally. Do you think that sometimes people are coming from a position of ignorance when they're covering religious stories, and that colours perhaps what we see on screen in the general media.
And just at the lady next door, if you could just introduce yourself as well, that'd be great, thanks.
Hello, my name's Ruth, and I've just come because I'm interested.
Great.
I think my question is, do you think the media has an agenda, and that it often focuses on, as you were saying, a change to like a shame culture, rather than like the good news stories wherever they may fit? Because there are people who have faith, whether they're institutionalized or not, and that gives them great joy, but that's not being shown. So my question is, if that is possible, that there's an agenda that doesn't want to show it, how can you change the media to want to show good news stories from the news into like dramas?
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's an agenda. I think there is a secularization. You know, there were times when people could give a quote in a speech from the Bible and people would pick up the connection. I just don't think people are educated that way. So I don't think it's an agenda so much as people really don't know what they don't know. And that's a huge problem. And religious literacy. Was that the question? You know, there's just a lot to know.
There's a lot to know, but what are the pitfalls for not having the religious literacy, particularly, as you've said, you know, are there narratives that we're missing here, as we missed, as you argued, in 1989? And what are the pitfalls of not having a religiously literate broadcast media?
I just think you miss the deep undercurrents. You only catch the surface. And the surface tends to be the bad news. I mean, we know that we are at least 5 times as likely to take notice of the bad news as we are of the good news. We discount the good news. That's the amygdala, that's our fight and flight reaction. So it makes a huge impact on us. And to the extent that people are trying to, what do you call that with the social media? You know, the thing that, the clickbait. It gets more and more superficial. And I just think we're missing so much. I mean...
But what's the answer to that? Is it sort of a bigotry in religious education for those who are working in the public sphere?
You need some expert on hand in any major medium outlet. You just need the people there who tell you what's significant and what isn't. I mean, you know, as soon as 9/11 happened, I was saying to myself, we need to understand this. So Elaine and I immediately invited, when he was next in London, the late Bernard Lewis, who was the world's great scholar on Islam, just to guide us through this. And I spent the next year or two just reading hundreds of books on Islam. I mean, you need somehow or other to have some expertise to hand to tell you, is this significant, isn't it significant?
And also understanding, to the second lady's point there, that there is space for unpacking some insight into religion, not necessarily just on news broadcasts, but there is in drama. We've seen Fleabag with the Catholic priest in Fleabag. We've seen other incidences in the soap operas where they've addressed moral issues, like assisted
you take
dying.
simple things here. Artificial intelligence. I'm speaking to I'm doing an interview with Nick Bostrom, the guy who coined the word superintelligence, and I'm thinking to myself, Sacks, what are you doing here? You are a great grandson of the Maharal of Prague, the Rabbi Judeloi of Prague, who created something called the Golan, which was artificial intelligence, you know. And quite a nice artificial intelligence, except he forgot to switch him off for the Sabbath, and the thing went berserk, you know. And I actually said to Nick, you know, are you telling me this is like the Jewish mother who says, now that I had a child, I can relate to God more because now I know what it's like to create something you can't control? You know, so it doesn't have to be newsworthy, but at least get a religious voice there on some of these big ethical issues. What makes a person? What sort of engagement should we have with genetic intervention? Should we be able to have genetic intervention in embryo, as it were, so that the very rich can have artificial enhancements of which the poor can't have? Where are we going on what constitutes a fair ratio between CEO salaries and median salaries within an organization? I mean, for heaven's sake, religions, the biggest agnostic ever was Hayek. And Hayek, in his last book, The Fatal Conceit, said, in effect, always follow the religion. Why? Because they've survived. And the fact that they've survived means they've got a lot of decisions right, which you can never get right thinking rationalistically, because whatever rationalization you make before making a decision, you cannot factor in the black swan, the law of unintended consequences. So religions, even for this total agnostic, have encoded within them a set of wisdoms that could only be established through the course of time. So bring them into the ethics sphere, bring them into drama, bring them into music, for heaven's sake. Mm-hmm. There's an enormous role for the religious voice.
Just a very last quick question from the gentleman at the back who's been very patient. Thank you.
Is this working?
Yeah, it is now.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Riddell from Humanist UK. Very interested in what you said. Obviously, I didn't agree with all of it. We're in a situation now which is really unprecedented in that we've got roughly half the population who don't have a religious identity, roughly half who don't have any religious belief, not necessarily the same half, of course, and the religious half more diverse than we've ever had in history. And no society has ever faced that situation before. What's your view on the actions we collectively should take in order to make that unique society work? And in particular, do you see shared values as a sort of route into a sort of collective common ground, or is that just too naive?
I don't think that's too naive at all. I think that shared values are probably a precondition of any society. And we have operated on the assumption for the past 50 years that that isn't so. Now, you can tell exactly what has happened in the United States. It has led, we had 25 years of individualism. But now, for the last 20 years or so, and this came to the fore in the 2016 presidential election, something called identity politics. Identity politics means the fragmenting of society into a whole different set of groups. And one candidate, Hillary Clinton, was doing identity politics, ticking the boxes for various constituencies. And the other one, Donald Trump, having the big identity group, which is, white, mainly males, but not exclusively, in the flyover states, who felt that they'd been ignored by the Washington elites. And so the whole of the 2016 election was a form of identity politics. Identity politics means the destruction of society as a single cohesive force. Now, what will it take to pull society together? It's a difficult one.
Do you see the leadership there currently amongst our political class?
No. Sorry about that, no.
No leadership from the political class in pulling a...
There's not only no leadership, there's no followership either, so we're in a mess. We are in a big, big, big mess. We certainly need leadership of an order that we haven't had. We need, number one, a leader who speaks to the anxieties of the age. not the anxieties of Westminster and Whitehall. Number two, we need somebody who is capable of telling the story that explains us to ourselves. Number three, we need a leader who can construct for us a coherent roadmap of hope. And number four, most important, in the Brexit debacle, we need a leader who is capable of being an educator also. What does this mean?
It's a big list. It's a big list.
What does this mean? What does it involve? Western liberal democracies are facing major challenges. And this means that we need major figures who are willing to step forward and say, I will do this. The real reason that they are not willing to do this is because we have lost that value that made, what was it, The Queen, the Netflix series, so successful, which is the concept of public service. That this is a moral duty for me to do this, even though I don't need it in any way, in any shape or form. Britain used to have people like that. And somehow I hope people like somebody like that will emerge, because we're desperately short of it. I have to tell you, look, can I just end with a little religious story, which moves me beyond, it moved me to tears when I saw it. In 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln writes a note in his diary. Why is this happening to us? Why are we tearing ourselves apart? This must be from God. And we must be being punished for something, but I don't know what it is. This he writes in 1862. In 1863, he establishes his Thanksgiving proclamation. Thanksgiving had been part of America since the Mayflower, but there was no collective date. People celebrated it on different days. Abraham Lincoln in 1863 was the first president to fix a date, the third Thursday in November or whatever it is. And he fixed this day. And it is a most extraordinary document. And the document tells me that he has been reading very closely, and he was not a big churchgoer, Abraham Lincoln, but he'd been reading very closely Deuteronomy 26, 27, 28. Deuteronomy 26 tells you about the importance of bringing your new fruits to Jerusalem and giving thanks. And then 28 is that horrendous list of curses that will happen to a nation. Why? Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and fullness of soul out of the abundance of all good things. He has worked out himself as a layperson that this is a punishment that is hitting America because we did not give thanks. And he ordains the whole of America to celebrate thanks on that one day. That act of 1863 lays the ground for him to be able to say, when the war is over in 1865, in the second inaugural, one of the greatest speeches in all political history, with charity to all, with malice to none, with charity to all, with doing the right as God gives us to see the right, let us continue the work of binding up the nation's wounds. That is how a layperson, who was not known to be deeply religious, meditated from a religious point of view and was able to heal a nation that had been riven by civil war. Now, could the next Abraham Lincoln please stand up? Thank you very much.
Lord Sacks, on that note, thank you so much. Such a wide-ranging insight into your current thinking, and the depth of knowledge and expertise that you've shared with us is hugely valuable. I can't thank you enough. It's been a great pleasure to listen to you and to speak to you also, and I'm sure echoed by all of us in the audience. Thank you very much indeed.